Slate's Joel Anderson feels like it's so common to hear about Black people being killed by the police that he's not actually sure when he first heard the name Tyre Nichols. Tyre was beaten by the cops in Memphis, Tennessee on January 7th. He died 3 days later. The 5 officers who attacked him, they got fired and then indicted last week.
Them firing those officers was sort of the incident that made me look and say,
Because it was remarkable.
Yeah, that didn't usually happen like that. Like sometimes it does, but often it doesn't. And that was sort of remarkable.
Joel has covered a lot of deaths by police. There was Michael Brown in Ferguson, Freddie Gray in Baltimore. Joel hosted a whole season of the Slow Burn podcast about Rodney King and the riots that followed his assault back in 1991, which is why I wanted to talk to Joel now.
Thank you so much, Pastor Thomas and Bishop Thomas, Bishop Williamson, for allowing us to be in your cathedral at this moment here in Memphis.
About a week ago, Tyre's family got their first glimpse of the video of the brutality that led to his death. And afterwards, they had this press conference with their lawyer, Ben Crump, to describe what they'd seen.
And what we saw, regrettably, it reminded us of Rodney King video. Regrettably. And unlike Rodney King, Tyre didn't survive.
As Crump said this, you could hear a little murmur spread through the crowd. And then Tyre's mother sagged her head as if she was unable to hold back a sob.
Well, I mean, Ben Crump has basically defended or represented the families of almost every notable Black death at the hands of police. Any name that sort of, of the Say Their Name campaign, Ben Crump has probably been there. And for him to look at that video and to say, this reminds me of Rodney King, it's hard to not take it seriously because he's seen it all. So for that guy who's seen it all to say, this looks like the most notorious incident of police brutality in American history, I mean, that has to mean something.
I have a kind of tough question that's a bit on my mind, and I wonder what you make of it, which is I sort of wonder if what had happened to Rodney King had happened to Tyre Nichols, that is, if Tyre had survived, but had still been beaten within an inch of his life. I wonder if you think we would know about it.
Oh, man.
Because all the tape comes from the cops themselves.
I mean, he would have been able to tell the tale, right? He would have been able to say, hey, the officers did this to me, but it probably would have been much harder to get people to care. And 4 or 5 days before Tyre Nichols, there was a guy who claimed he'd been beaten up in roughly the same way, and that he tried to get the attention of the authorities and that they didn't take him seriously. I mean, there's no way of knowing, but and certainly looking at what we saw, the video that we did, it's reasonable to assume that that was not their first time attacking a citizen in quite that way before. It looked like they had some experience with that before.
Today on the show, the story of Tyre Nichols and what it shows about how far we've come since Rodney King. Maybe not very far at all. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you hearing my voice right now are probably multitasking. Yep, even while you're listening, you are probably driving, cleaning, exercising, maybe grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there is something else you could be doing right now. Getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's easy and you can save money by doing it right from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save nearly $700 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year, so you're protected no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join over 29 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $698 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Discounts are not available in all states and situations. Support for this podcast comes from Wise, the universal account that lets you send, spend, and receive money internationally. With one account for over 50 currencies, who exactly is Wise made for? It's made for jet setters and slow travelers, for seeing old friends in new places. Wise is made for business in the city and pleasure on the coast, for studying abroad and supporting your little brother's schooling back home. Wise is made for people without borders, who want to live truly global lives with ease. You see, with Wise, you always get the mid-market exchange rate whenever you convert or spend different currencies. There are no markups and no hidden fees. That's pounds to pesos, dollars to dong, just like that. Helping you save on currency conversion wherever your money takes you. Wise, it's the account that's made for the world. Join 13 million customers and learn how the Wise account could work for you at wise.com/whatnext. I'm wondering if you can just introduce me to Tyre. Like, who was he? Like, I've seen all these very charming skateboarding videos of him, but what do we know about him?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the lovely thing. All over social media, people are sharing that short video of him skateboarding, something that he clearly had a knack for. You know, Tyre was a 29-year-old black man who worked the second shift at the local FedEx facility, and someone who was clearly close to his mother. You know, his family said that every evening about 7 o'clock, he'd go to his mom's house for his lunch break. He even tattooed his mother's name on his arm. And his mother took a lot of pride in that because, you know, not a lot of sons, not a lot of guys are getting their mom's name tattooed on them, which is just sort of shows you how close they were. And he was a parent himself. He was a father to a 4-year-old son. So, you know, he just seemed to be sort of an everyman, a blue-collar worker in Memphis who was raising his child and was close to his family and apparently stopped at the same Starbucks for coffee every morning. Just a regular guy.
We don't seem to know a lot about the traffic stop that led to his death. And the video doesn't seem to tell very much about that either. It just starts right away with police sort of charging at the car. But what do we know?
So, yeah, it all starts that night in January when the officers claimed they were pursuing his vehicle for suspected reckless driving. And, you know, as at this point, we have no way to sustain whether or not that's true. But, yeah, a lot of people who've seen that body cam and surveillance videos, they show that first initial stop when the officers confront Tyre. They drag him out of the car and start yelling these conflicting and contradictory orders at him. You know, show us your hands. And they're holding his hands. Or get on the ground. He's already on the ground.
And he says that, too. He's like, I'm on the ground.
He said, I'm on the ground. I'm on the ground. I didn't do anything. And there's nothing that, I mean, I defy anyone to explain to me how he could have done anything to de-escalate it. They pulled him out of his car. He's trying to comply, but they won't allow him to comply with some of their commands. You know, it's funny. A few years ago, I talked with the Houston police chief at the time, Acevedo. He ended up going to Miami and didn't last in that position long. And, you know, he was talking about how he had a teenage son. And I said, well, what would you do? You know, you're Latino. If your son gets pulled over by the police, what do you tell them? He says, well, I would just say, you know, make sure you don't make any sudden movements and, you know, be respectful and, you know, be cautious. And I'm like, that's the sort of thing you say if you encounter a mountain lion in the wild, you know, and that's not really helpful. I mean, it really all depends on how good a mood and does that cop respect you enough to treat you like you're somebody that pays his tax dollars. And I mean, you look at that stop, and obviously those police officers, they didn't think of themselves as public servants. They thought of themselves as public warriors. And there's nothing that Tyre Nichols could have done to prevent them from treating him in the way that they did that night.
And these officers were part of this Scorpion unit that Memphis Police Chief C.J. Davis had set up, where part of the whole idea was to stop a lot of reckless driving, to improve quality of life and bring down crime too, I guess?
Right. Yeah. Chief Davis had mentioned something, I think within the last year, about how when she moved to Memphis, she'd never seen crazy reckless driving like she had there. And so this was a part of that. And also, the quote Scorpion unit was meant to get guns off the street. And this all happens in the wake of, was sort of a natural and understandable rise in crime in the last few years, because we'd had decades of crime lows. And so at some point, it seemed reasonable to expect that crime was going to tick back up. And when it did, things like the Scorpion unit came back online, or there's all these other sort of SWAT-like police units that police departments all around the country starting up again in hopes of combating crime.
Tyre Nichols encountered the police a couple of times. And part of what this video shows is that people didn't treat him. The paramedics who eventually arrived, they didn't seem to intervene with him. And eventually he was taken to the hospital and he died 3 days later. Something that stands out to me about this case is how quickly local authorities publicly admitted something had gone wrong. Because if I look back at Minneapolis when George Floyd was murdered, the initial reaction from the police was, man dies after medical incident during police interaction. With Tyre, when he passed, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation announced he died due to injuries sustained in a use of force incident. And to me, that was the beginning of something seeming slightly different about this case. Do you think that's where it starts for you as well? Or was it a few days later?
That's a good question. I mean, definitely the local government response to admit that Tyre had been injured in this incident and to fire them. Like, obviously, it lets you know, whoa, something horrible has gone on here. And they don't really see any way around it. And yeah, I mean, I guess sometimes I'm just sort of cynical about this thing because, this is not the first time that a local police department has, when some of their police officers have been involved in a brutality or abuse, that they've sort of thrown that cop in front of the bus and said, hey, look, this is really bad. We're going to charge this guy. So it's not uncommon, especially with black officers, for them to not necessarily get the sort of defense that white officers get in these incidents. But everybody in local government lined up so quickly to not only fire and then arrest and charge these officers. It was a clue that something really, really horrible had happened. And we just had to sort of wait to see exactly what that was going to be.
And then it seemed like everyone was tensing and waiting for Friday night because the police had done this thing that struck me as a little bit strange, which they said, we're going to release the video after 6 p.m. Central Time on Friday. And so it was kind of all everyone could talk about. Like, they created this anticipation. And I really didn't know what to make of it at the time. Like, is this a strategy to get out front? Is that the right strategy? Like, how will people react? Because essentially, the chief of police was saying, you have a right to be angry about this video. She went on CNN the morning before they released it and said, you're going to see a lack of humanity.
You're going to see a disregard for life, duty of care that we're all sworn to, and a level of physical interaction that is above and beyond what is required in law enforcement.
Which was such a strange thing. I just never seen it happen in that order. The pre-release.
Yeah.
The police saying this is bad, and then the release.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I mean, you can be very cynical here and say that they're throwing themselves at the mercy of the public square, right? That they wanted to head off any potential protests to at least keep the temperature down in the city. Maybe that move is successful. Maybe it wasn't. There's still a long way to go. But yeah, absolutely. I think they wanted to give themselves some time to get into position and come up with an emergency plan to deal with the fallout. And I mean, I would like to think that they thought this is so horrible that people are rightly going to be outraged, and we want to give them some chance to prepare to deal with it. And, also for people in town to not, just cut on their TV and accidentally see that, to give them a moment to prepare. But I also think that it was a way to protect themselves and to give themselves a chance to get into order, so to speak.
What police are trying to protect themselves from, anytime an incident like this happens, is a replay of what took place in Los Angeles 30 years back. That's when Rodney King was beaten by 4 LAPD officers, while unbeknownst to them, a neighbor recorded the whole thing using his brand new video camera. Rodney King was trying to flee a traffic stop, just like Tyre, and the tape was immediately shocking.
Dramatic videotape obtained by Channel 5 News shows what appears to be a group of LAPD officers beating a suspect.
As soon as it hit the airwaves, it created a firestorm.
A year later, when a jury acquitted the officers of any wrongdoing in the King case, Los Angeles erupted.
Be cool with that camera. Hey, be cool with that camera. And now stand in front of that camera. Don't let him get that film.
Joel says part of what makes Tyre Nichols' story different is that this time, the damning footage was captured by the police themselves. There were cameras mounted on the street, body cams too. But all these years later, even though technology like officer-worn cameras are changing what we can see, they aren't necessarily changing how police behave.
Body cams can be useful, but they're not as useful because it also depends on the officer. I mean, they'd had an incident in Memphis before where a police officer had killed a young black man. He turned off his camera, right? So we're sort of, if they have the presence of mind to cut off their camera or shed that camera, then we're not going to see everything. And yeah, I mean, in the last 30 years, the ubiquity of the camera. I mean, we all have a camera now. And back in 1991, when the Rodney King incident happened, that was the reason it exploded. I mean, also because we had never seen brutality like that captured on camera in quite that way before. But also, nobody had seen a video like that. It was just very unusual for somebody to have something like that.
We've talked about how the reaction from people in power was notable this time. And it was also different from how people in power responded with Rodney King. Like when I went back and looked, it seemed to me like after the Rodney King video was released, it created a lot of tension in Los Angeles leadership between the police chief, the mayor, as opposed to what we've seen here, which is people kind of moving more in lockstep. Like we saw on Saturday over the weekend, this Scorpion unit, which the police chief had created, they disbanded. They said, yep, not doing that anymore. But you've raised this kind of cynical thing about this, and I want to get into that because one thing that happened with Rodney King is that the tension caused there to be the Christopher Commission, like an investigation of like what's wrong with the police force. And I wonder a little bit if getting out in front of things like this means that there's not going to be a kind of Christopher Commission in Memphis, someone coming in and saying like, okay, let's get all the dirty laundry out there. Does that worry you a little bit?
I think what I always sort of worry about in these instances is that there's this initial outrage and shock. And then the officers get charged, and then people sort of get a chance to retreat into their corners. And then the police get more defensive because the public is rightly outraged at them and is asking them to investigate themselves, to reform themselves, to show more public contrition. And they eventually get really upset and then they sort of close their ranks. And that's actually what happened in the Rodney King case. Initially, it's amazing because LA's mayor at the time, Tom Bradley, and LAPD's police chief, Daryl Gates, they did not get along. I mean, they hated each other. They'd been longtime political rivals. And in the immediate aftermath of the release of the tape, they were roughly on the same page. They were like, this is horrible. Like, this does not represent LAPD, which, okay, sure. But they were all sort of on the same page. And then as the idea for the commission came up and as the case sort of wound its way through the legal system, then people had a chance to sort of go back to their original entrenched positions. And so that's sort of the thing that I'll be looking for here. Like, Memphis leadership all seems to be on the same page. You know, the police chief, the mayor, the local prosecutor, they're all there together now. But will they be there in a year and a half when this case goes to trial, or if the case goes to trial? And will all of these same people still be in place then? And will they all feel the same way that they do about what happened?
When we come back, how much does it matter that the 5 officers charged in this case were all Black themselves?
You can hear Puerto Rico's music all over the world. Tucked into our lyrics are stories about who we are.
Un Puerto Rico de ensueño.
And what we want.
When you live on the margins, you have to know a lot of other things to survive.
From WNYC Studios and Futuro Studios, it's a new season of La Brega, the Puerto Rican experience in 8 songs.
Estás escuchando La Brega.
La Brega.
La Brega.
La Brega.
Listen wherever you get podcasts.
Something I want to make sure we talk about the death of Tyre Nichols is that the police officers involved, they're all Black. Memphis also has a Black police chief. I just wonder what you make of that, and whether in some ways it shows like a fundamental misunderstanding that may exist about who's trustworthy on the police force, whether police are trustworthy at all.
Sure. Well, so, I mean, I'd note that most of the major cities in this country at this point have had Black police chiefs. Like, if you pretty much go through the list of every major metropolitan city in America, they've had Black police chiefs. New York, LA, Chicago, Houston, Philly, Phoenix, Dallas, so on and so forth. They've all had Black police chiefs. The idea that the officers look different because they're all 5 Black officers, this is not really that new. You know, 7 years or so ago, I covered the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and I was there for the initial public response to that death, and then I covered the trial of the officers. And at that time, Baltimore had a Black mayor and a majority Black police force, and had had several Black police chiefs over the years. And I spoke with, community leaders, activists, and former Black police officers in Baltimore. And truthfully, they never had the trust or support of the people in the communities they patrolled. Like, maybe a few individual officers did, sure, but on the whole, it's not like people were sitting around making a lot of distinctions between Black officers and police chiefs and the white ones. And I've seen other people say this, so I can't credit it to anyone specifically, but they said, basically, the race of a cop is cop. And again, over the weekend, there's been 1 million retweets of James Baldwin about Black police that have been meaningful and salient. But the one that really struck me was that he once said in Notes of a Native Son, Negro policemen are feared more than whites, for they have more to prove and fewer ways to prove it. So anybody that has ever had a run-in with a Black cop, you know that you are not necessarily going to get treated any better by virtue of the fact that they're Black. And in fact, it may go even worse.
Which is interesting because I feel like so often the diversity of a police force is brought up as like a really important goal of how to make policing better. And I think what you see here is like, it's just not an endpoint in and of itself. It's not meaningful without other things happening at the same time.
It's tough because if we're going to have police and we're going to devote all this money to police, like any local government's largest expenditure is the money that it devotes to public safety vis-a-vis, the police department or the county sheriff's department. If we're going to spend all that money and they're just going to be a fact of life, then they probably should be diverse. Like, we don't want to turn it all over to to people that, you know, have not been around Black people, may have animus towards Black people. But I think we've seen at every police department in this country that even any well-meaning attempt to diversify does not necessarily produce different outcomes. And I always just say, there was a time in my life when every time a Black person got killed by police, I had to go somewhere. I always was flying around the country for about 3 or 4 years. And I just said, you can go to any corner of this country, from Seattle to Key West to Maine to San Diego, and Black people, regardless of who is in charge, who makes up the majority of the force, they have a legitimate gripe about the way they're being treated by the law enforcement community there. So unfortunately, that's just something. If you're hoping for police reform, diversity, fine, sure, but it can't end there, and you're going to have to go much further.
I want to go back to the comparison between Tyre Nichols and Rodney King just for a moment to just underline something that you brought up earlier, which is that I feel like over this weekend, there was a sigh of relief because there had been so much buildup for this release of the video and people saying, please be peaceful when you protest. And then the protests were largely peaceful. And I think a lot of people, myself included, sort of felt like, okay, like, great, like things seem to be happening, moving in the right direction. But when you look back at Rodney King, the LA riots, they didn't happen right after the video came out. They happened when those officers were acquitted. And it just reminded me, like, this is such a long path we're on. And I just wonder if that's like sort of on your mind as well.
Yeah, I mean, we have a long way to go. And I would like to remind people, from the circumstance with the LAPD officers. I mean, so they get acquitted and there's the riots. And this is all happening in the backdrop of a mayoral reelection between the hand-chosen successor to the Democratic incumbent and another guy who was, sort of a Republican. And he ran on a plank of tough on crime. So, not even barely a full year after you're looking at that incident with Rodney King, and that guy, a fundamental city outsider, he was not a person who had held a position in government before, but he says, it's time to clean up the crime in this town. And he gets elected. And I also go back to like what has happened since the George Floyd incident. There was a few months people took it very seriously in criminal justice reform, and it looked like we were going to get things done. And it's just hard to argue that there hasn't been a negative reaction against that, to the idea of defund police or, even a modicum of police reform. So, yeah, I mean, again, we seem to be in a good place today, but we have an awful long way to go.
Joel, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for doing this.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Joel Anderson is a staff writer at Slate. He also hosted seasons 3 and 6 of Slow Burn. After our conversation ended, a 6th Memphis police officer got suspended from duty. The Memphis Fire Department has also suspended 2 paramedics who'd been at the scene. Tyre Nichols' family has asked that those EMTs be criminally charged. And that's the show. What Next is produced by Elena Schwartz, Carmel Delshad, and Madeline Ducharme. We are getting a ton of support these days from Anna Phillips, Jared Downing, and Laura Spencer. We're led by Alicia Montgomery, with a little assist from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Go track me down on Twitter, say hello. I'm at Mary's Desk. All right, I'll talk to you tomorrow.